Okay, so I guess last week we started with the history hashkafa side of the issue. First, we can continue in this with this framework. So we left off last week. We had just discussed the early, effectively heretical sects of Judaism. These kind of crazy reform movements that tended either to take the scripture extra super literally, or to seek to uproot certain mitzvot or certain concepts, and basically that Christianity was the biggest and the most effective of these groups, the one that really caught on. Fortunate confluence of events that the self-proclaimed Holy Roman Empire, at the time just the Roman Empire, was not super excited about religion in general. Much of the persecution the Christians claimed they suffered from in the beginning was really at the hands of, first probably it was the Jewish communities, another persecution. They were excluded from tefillot. They didn't want them participating. They sought to teach people that this was their authentic take on Judaism. I don't know how familiar you are with church doctrine, because we're going to talk about this a little bit. The church has many times throughout its history attempted to assert the claim that the church is the legitimate continuation of the Torah and of the prophetic tradition.
Yeah, Neos Israel or something like that.
That's effectively, they're trying to say that it's not that they broke with or reformed from Judaism, which is exactly what happened, but rather that if you read through all the prophets, meaning him included, and if you read through all the scriptures, this makes perfect sense. You would arrive at this conclusion too. Anyone would. It's not just that the Christians decided, Torah is too hard, we're taking off. It's that God decided that it's okay, and the deal changed. And so through that perspective, the Jews look very primitive and antiquated, and were observing mitzvot that no longer apply. But that was always their contention from the very beginning, especially during the first 3 or 4 centuries. That was their point. We use the same word in Hebrew, knessia. Really means a bet knesset. Batei Knesiot, Batei Midrashot, we have reference to the, we refer to both churches and synagogues with the same term, the same etymological root, and there's a reason for it. They opened their own synagogues, and we had our own, and they, in the beginning, maybe worshipped in ways that were similar to what it is that we do, and eventually less and less. I could go on at great length about the similarities, really what was copied from Judaism into Christianity. Suffice it to say that things like the communion, this whole concept of making kiddush and having some zanot after tefillah on what they consider their Shabbat. No, I mean this is like one for one. It's not even funny. The whole aspect of tevilah. So for them, baptism is just a means of converting your way into this new religion, just like we would require tevilah from any man or woman who wants to become Jewish and wasn't born that way. It's much more so in Catholicism than in Protestantism. They really believe this to be one of the very few things that you actually have to do in order to become a Christian, but it's there. And then very prominently ignored would be the Brit Milah, that they definitely don't require. That refers specifically back to Avraham Avinu. Plus, it's really hard to convince lots of people to do it. So, let's say baptism is much easier, less invasive. So, I guess that was an easier sale.
The Lulav as well. They have that.
Yeah, that's what they copied. There are books on this, by the way. They're not very popularly studied right now.
You're a specialist?
You never noticed?
No, I've seen them going out of the church.
Have you ever read an American calendar, Palm Sunday?
Yeah, living at the top.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry.
Just
say it in Italian, it sounds much more idolatrous. So Palm Sunday, you never heard this? I don't know if they do it in France, but it's a Catholic thing.
Yeah, I've seen that when I was...
Where they don't sit there have a whole procession where they march with palm fronds. These are totally pasul. This is classic because it's the opposite. The Mishnah says that the lulav needs to be closed, and if it's open, then it's pasul. And they take these big, wide open ones. They can shake them and they can enjoy them. They have no idea what they're doing. They don't know why it's there. They can't explain, even according to their own theology, they can't explain why they're doing it. Or why anybody in Scandinavia or Northern Europe should be looking for palm fronds that don't grow there. But they continue to do it. That's their remnant, the vestiges of Chag HaSukkot. Easter obviously was Pesach. In fact, they still use the term Pâques in French, which is Pascha
Yeah.
from Aramaic. So it was a clear copy, one for one. This invariably, it sounds funny, but we'll talk about it also in just a little bit. How certain vestigial concepts or traditions will still pervade, even despite the theology. I mean, even if they believe that the deal is over and a new deal was struck, they're still going to keep certain things that aren't even mentioned in the New Testament, just in order to. It lends a certain sense of credibility. You know, if we didn't throw everything away, the more things we kept, the more authentic it looks. You have that. Go ahead.
Maybe you have a shiur plan on this next week or in a couple of weeks, but what about the Muslims? They pretty much copy-pasted a bunch of our stuff as well.
They did, but they copied and pasted wrong. They fat-fingered a
Yeah,
lot
of
of
course
keys
they
in the
did.
process because a lot of their mitzvot are backwards, and a lot of it they copied very inaccurately.
But they went more stringent on a bunch of things.
I didn't plan to talk about Islam in this context only because they certainly eliminated more than half the mitzvot. That is no question. In fact, they probably have less than 10%, if anything. It's just that I don't know that they saw themselves so much as reformers as building on it. They just happen to have ignored a lot of mitzvot in the process. Christianity, it's really it's the canon. It's theologically assumed that the mitzvot no longer apply, at least except for 7 or 8 of them. So it's not that the Muslims tell you the mitzvot no longer apply. They don't even hold from this. They hold, and if you ask them, they'll tell you this is the fact. They believe that in the beginning the Jews were the one and only prophetic tradition. All the prophets who spoke in Hebrew through Judaism, and then the Jews didn't commit the story to writing, so they lost it and it became corrupt. That's literally what they say. Say something about the Christians, how they had Jesus, he was another prophet, but the story became corrupted and the students ran away with it, and so until you have Islam, nobody had order in these things. Irony of all ironies, first of all, that Judaism and Christianity came first. Second of all, that the Christian copy of the Old Testament pretty much corroborates 99.99% of what it is that we've been saying all along. And then beyond this, that Islam has a whole bunch of anachronisms. They make references to things that have no kesher. Miriam, the sister of Moshe, is the mother of Jesus in the Quran. Like Moshe and Jesus played
They have the same
cards
name.
when they were little, huh?
You can choose the name.
Yeah, well, I mean, pretty simply, according to them, Haman was one of the advisors to Paro. I mean, Akedat Ishmael. Have you ever heard this? No, it's funny. You know, not funny
This
to them.
came
It's funny to
later,
us.
right? I heard that it came later.
They claim the whole thing began in the 7th century, 8th century. I mean, how long it took to commit to writing. They admit, by the way, literally, that Muhammad himself was illiterate. They don't even claim he knew how to write. I guess it's just one of those identification things. When most of the population is still illiterate, it's easy to explain to people. You don't need to know how to read or write in order to be religious, in order to be observant, in order to find favor in the eyes of God. But they claim, in fact, if you'd like proof of this, go to the dollar store on 97th in Amsterdam. It's owned by a Yemeni Arab family, and so this guy, every time I go in there, he tries to convert me to Islam. So he throws a few words in Hebrew, he says Shabbat Shalom, and he's like, come on, now when are you going to start worshiping Muhammad? Just comes out right away.
Really?
So he's telling me what's like,
Never tried
don't
that.
you have a pasuk in the prophet Isaiah that says, Yeshaya, about an illiterate man speaking the word of God and prophecy? I was like, no, actually we're really big fans of literacy. We believe that people knowing how to read and write, it's a good, positive thing. Like people read the Chumash, we study these things, we debate them. So they hold, apparently, in their copy of Yeshaya, there's this whole thing about someone illiterate learning how to speak the word of God, without knowing how to write. And he needed someone else to write it down for him. All right, it's a separate story. But, more on the topic of reform, here's where it gets really interesting because, the Christians basically pulled it off. The Christians were the first group that actually said we need to reform Judaism completely and entirely. And they have this dilemma they just can't let go of. The dilemma is, are we in fact the perpetuators, the continuers of this, what they refer to as the Jacobin tradition, meaning Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov? Does our legitimacy derive from, the Torah that was given to Moshe and Am Yisrael in the desert, or at Sinai, or is our legitimacy a whole other prophecy from a whole other prophet, and that New Deal basically supplants the old one and replaces it, and we're a separate nation unto ourselves, and it's inescapable. There's no way you can separate Christianity from its early roots, and at the same time, they've been fighting very, very hard to borrow this legitimacy without actually reverting back to the Torah and the Mitzvot. They'll refer to it, but they're always conflicted with what applies, what doesn't, what do we consider a part of the New Deal, what don't we. Lots of things aren't mentioned explicitly. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, homosexuality. Where does it say in the New Testament that you can't? Maybe now that he came and forgave everybody's sins, that one's a freebie. I don't know. How do you decide or determine kashrut? They can eat whatever they want. In terms of arayot, I mean, not too many sexual restrictions in the New Testament. So, what exactly are the defining features of it, except for belief in him that he'll fix your problems, your mortgage? So the Christians pulled it off. It wasn't without challenges. Obviously, there were different. Aside from the fact they were rejected by the Jews, they were rejected by the Romans in the beginning, and then Christianity changed a little bit over the next couple of centuries. And I would say the most significant and most meaningful. Well, it's instructive to understand the Great Schism, if you're familiar with this, the split between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church, where at this point, the Eastern Orthodox Church was saying there is a lot of craziness and a lot of way out there ideas that we refuse to incorporate into our religious observance. Number one, the Catholics made the claim that the communion was basically the consumption of the flesh and blood of Jesus. So you're eating from the wafers, the mezonot, and you have some of this sacrificial wine, and it's supposed to represent or reflect. So the Orthodox said, listen, Adkan, come on, seriously. It's as if, it's ke'ilu, it's kind of like, it's not exactly the same thing. The Catholics said, no, the kavanah you're supposed to have is exactly the same thing because he saved us, we have to eat him. Or eating him was the only way to save him. Duke it out. Feel free to debate and discuss. We'll have a break in a little bit and we'll be able to talk about that. And then you had this concept of the infallibility of the Pope. Now the Pope was the speaker, the mouthpiece of God. He's basically Ayatollah, by the way, means the same thing in Arabic. This like the scribe of God, the one who just what he writes is the word of God. God would have written it, but he got to it first. Everything he says is just a decree from God. So the infallibility of the Pope, it carries a lot of severity to it. So basically you're telling me you ignore the Old Testament, which you acknowledge was given by prophets to the nation, and all of a sudden the Pope becomes the new prophet who can make mitzvot and make church law and doctrine, cancel some things and incorporate others. That was the big split. It was over the papacy. And then later it became evident, I don't think it was part of the Great Schism, but the idea that the priests weren't allowed to marry in the Western Catholic Church, and the Orthodox priests are expected to marry. That's a perfectly normal thing by them, and you'll find the Protestants did the same thing there. So, okay, fast forward to the 17th century. Probably the beginnings are in the late 16th century, but the 17th century, and now you have the Protestant Reform. This is for the most part Germany, a little bit of help from Switzerland.
More than a little. I mean, Geneva is the capital of Protestant.
It was. Are they still?
Calvin, I mean.
No, John Calvin for sure was helpful. Very bizarre theology that he had, but
There's a whole. Geneva is the city of the Protestants. It's
I mean no offense to the Swiss.
Part of the history.
Luther wasn't Swiss, but no, for sure he got support and help from there. That's weird. So Fribourg was pretty Catholic. I remember that. Canton by canton, I'm sure it's different, but Geneva's
the city of Protestants.
right. So all the French speakers in Geneva are,
No, I'm not saying the whole population is, but in history, Geneva played a very big role.
I get that. I'm saying, are there in fact cathedrals in Geneva, or it's all Protestant
There's also a
churches?
cathedral. Yeah, there's a cathedral.
I'm sure it changed hands
I've
over
never
the
seen one.
generations.
Must be mosques.
So, because it wasn't long after this that the Swiss confederated, basically the late 1600s. So,
But there were Jews also in Switzerland, and like now, from like the 1400s.
you don't know, they had
So
older populations that
religiously,
were
it's
also
always been
extirpated.
pretty liberal.
Well, I get that. But the Reform spread like wildfire through Germany anyway. That was really, I think, where not just the original inspiration for it, but the military support for it. They were willing to go to war with other countries over this religious concept. So the arguments were made. Irony of all ironies. See how things come full circle. How the Bible was exclusively printed in Latin. It was considered a violation of church doctrine. Not that it says anywhere that you can't, but the popes all held this way, that the Bible shouldn't be translated out of the Latin, lest, God forbid, something be lost in the translation. This concept of the infallibility of the Pope, the corruption of the priests. They were taking turumot and ma'asrot, basically tithes. If you look through medieval European art, it's fascinating. But most of the painters who didn't fear for their lives painted priests as fat people. No, really, look at the pictures. I mean, it gets worse and worse, especially in France. It gets really bad in the 17th and early 18th centuries, where all these priests are these just fat, greasy types that are always holding on to chickens, ducks, geese, swans. They always have like fatty birds. They have fatty meats. They can drink. Interestingly, in Belgium, but it's true also of Switzerland, and I don't know so much about France, but certainly in Germany, where it was actually the priests who were brewing beer. This is like, it wasn't just that they were entitled to certain things. Like, these were the master brewers, where they were sitting on the best of the alcoholic beverages available at the time. So we talked about the origins of Christianity, and you see how it comes right back full circle, how then they were concerned about the rabbis, the lay leaders of the nation being corrupt, about the kiuna being purchased for money, the kohanim gedolim being appointed by important families that have sway and that have political influence. And all of a sudden, it didn't take all that long, and Christianity is suffering from many of the same things. I mention this not only because, yes, it's true, they were also guilty of a lot of the same joys and challenges that we were as a nation. Any organized religion is going to have to put up with this. But also, so yes, it's true that they did engender and eventually suffer from the same problems, but also because their religion was supposed to be the solution to these problems, and it failed them pretty miserably. If you understand a little bit about the French Revolution, for example, it was as much a revolution against the church as it was against the aristocracy. Effectively, they were part of the same thing. And members of the aristocracy were close enough with the church not to have to go or do anything. They would give them money, and they got permission to take certain taxes, and everybody was, politically speaking, enjoying eating at the same trough. But it wasn't. The peasants were suffering both at the hands of the church and at the hands of the aristocracy. So Luther gets upset, and he decides that the only solution to this problem is to re-reform Judaism. And just a couple of interesting details on this. One is that Luther's translation, when I was studying German, I went through this in the original German. Pretty fascinating. This became the standard High German for most of Germany's literary history, because the book was printed and it was the New Testament, his translation of it. He used Perush Rashi to translate the Old Testament, which is pretty fascinating.
You spoke Hebrew?
Yes, and by the way, when I was in Fribourg, the same thing. They had a faculty of theology. Everyone had to do at least 2 semesters of Hebrew over there. And they all learned Sefer Shmuel for some reason. I don't know why. Not that it's Shmuel Navi's fault. But there was a time where I certainly think the Franciscan Brotherhood at least in the canton of Fribourg, where I studied, they had as a requirement, you couldn't become a monk or a priest without having done Jesuits, I believe, also. I don't think they ever stopped teaching Hebrew. I don't know if it's still as much of a requirement. Don't know too many Jesuits, I'll be honest with you.
But even in the
I knew one. There was one guy in Fribourg actually who was there, going into the priesthood. A guy from Quebec, from the middle of nowhere. But they insisted that you should learn how to read and write Hebrew. Didn't do much with it. But the idea was that he felt it was corrupted somewhere along the way. Right? This is all going to play into the Reform movement as a whole. Bear with me a little bit. But he felt that if the Catholic Church was guilty of all the same things they accused the Jews of being guilty of then, they're part of the same problem. And so he turns the wheel back and he says, Tov, we have to go back to the source, back to the origin, translate it from someone, with the help of someone who is loyal to this tradition, i.e. Rashi. he really thought the Jews were going to come with him too. He thought this was really, Judaism still desperately needs reform. On the other hand, the Catholics couldn't pull it off, so he makes this complaint. But he's a big advocate for education, for teaching people being able to read the Tanakh in their own language, come to their own conclusions, decentralization of power. He doesn't believe in priests or the Pope, certainly doesn't believe in the Pope. He thinks the whole hierarchy is corrupt, and that the only real arbiters of the truth are people who are knowledgeable, enlightened, erudite, familiar with the material. So it's about 100 years later that this concept of reform sweeps through Judaism. Now, for Luther, this was a tremendous disappointment. I mean, he died before it happened, but he really believed that his Reformation, which, by the way, we still refer to as Reformation. I refer to Catholicism as a Reformation, but Luther refers to his movement as a Reformation, and he was very disappointed the Jews didn't follow him. A lot of there was anti-Semitism in Germany before there were Jews there, but this goes back to the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash. A lot of it became much more intense at this particular period. Like, okay, you didn't convert to Christianity all these years, but that's because we were all Catholics and we were all corrupt. Now that we're Reformed, now that we're Protestant, acknowledge that you have to admit we have something to sell here. The Jews didn't bite. So what eventually happened was that the Jews were put under pressure. There were religious wars going on. That's never really a happy situation to be in. And so naturally, when you're put under pressure, people tend to go in one of two possible directions. Either you just double down on your identity, you just hang on tight to your roots, you do whatever you can to retain what you have by way of tradition and identity, or you try really hard to assimilate. And this was happening at a time where there were a lot of, this is already well into the Renaissance period, lots of discoveries in physics and astronomy and chemistry, etc. So this idea that Luther had that people need to read more and learn more and make decisions for themselves and be a little bit less censored by the church, effectively caught on. So in Jewish circles, they started to refer to this as the Haskalah. Right? The word lahaskil in Hebrew means to study, to become learned, to exercise your knowledge. Most unfortunately, the word was kidnapped and tortured by the Jewish reformers, where Haskalah meant becoming secular and learning science and learning chemistry, etc. There was not a very good relationship between Torah observant Judaism and the sciences that were, or the arts for that matter, that were really exploding at the time. And this is, it's one of these facts we have to acknowledge. If you want to talk about the destruction of Beit HaMikdash, how and why it happened, and why different movements grew out of it, you have to be honest. We know that the Kohanim were corrupt. We know that the leaders were corrupt. We know that the rabbis were out to lunch, and some of them were in people's pockets, and some of them were just ineffectual, unable to speak and to help people change their ways. This was a very, very difficult period for observant Jews in general. And so what happens when you're under pressure like this, either you can just stick your head in the ground, Teishi. You can stick your head in the ground and you can say, Tov, these sciences, they make people crazy. And the more you learn, the crazier you get. That's an expression like this in Arabic. So we see that people either go to university and become chilonim, or they stay in the Beit Midrash and they remain observant. So the response of what we're going to call, for our intents and purposes, the Haredi community was basically, we need to, if the Goyim don't build the walls of the ghetto, we'll have to repair them. We need to keep to ourselves, make sure the Torah is passed on. And then you have the reformers who said, listen, the Torah, like the people who observe it, a little bit primitive, a little bit antiquated, a little bit out of date. If you look around you, you can see the wonders of modern science and modern medicine and the developments in music and in the arts. So we can throw out the good with the bad. We can presume that whatever the Torah believes in is just out of touch and out of date, anachronistic, and we'll just adopt the mores or the customs at the time. One of the, we'll use the Catholic term, saving graces of of the Jewish communities at this time in Europe, mind you, none of this was happening in, amongst the Sephardim, at least not outside of Europe, was the fact that between the Protestant Reformations and the wars, the Franco-Prussian wars, some of these religious wars that were taking place literally in Central and West Central Europe, more and more people became less and less observant. In other words, you had people who were fighting on one side or the other, either in the name of Protestantism or the name of Catholicism. But along with the sciences and the arts, the focus became less, gradually, less heavily placed on religion as a central feature of life, and people started to focus naturally more on the advances in science, agriculture, medicine, etc., such that they weren't necessarily living and breathing religion 24 hours a day. So out of the Haskalah, you find Jews, some of whom, by the way, probably led this movement, because they were coming out of a community where everybody was Orthodox and observant. They're saying, Tov, secular culture, non-Jewish societies, the society that gave me all of these blessings of the arts and the sciences, etc. I'd like to live a modern life and a modern lifestyle. And so for me, leaving my Jewish community doesn't necessarily mean I want to become a Christian. I might think their religion is about as outdated and anachronistic as my own. So a lot of the Jews that were leaving Judaism weren't necessarily becoming Christians. They were just unaffiliated or uninterested in religious observance of just about any kind. And it wasn't necessarily a much healthier place to be. The reformers, you have to understand this in context, right? And Moshe Mendelssohn would be the first one that we need to name, was trying to keep people from becoming totally secular. In other words, he was trying to teach them that it's okay to have some kind of religious identity. He's very wrongly painted by Orthodox and right of Orthodox historians, if you will, as someone who actively encouraged people to stop being observant or to leave the religion or to, as if to say, go follow the sciences, go to university, go study music or the arts. That's your true calling. The man was a theologian. I mean, he was very much a liberal theologian in the sense that he was open to lots of new ideas and willing to reconsider a lot of the tenets that we consider pretty basic to Judaism. But he was doing this in the name of religion. So he was really the one who came out and said, you know what? It's possible that you attend university, that you conduct an orchestra, that you become a doctor or an astronomer or whatever it is, and still retain some kind of Jewish identity. But I don't think your Jewish identity needs to be on prominent display for everyone to appreciate. Did he actually want Jews to marry non-Jews? No, he never said anything like that. And this is a whole other story. In other words, the avalanche that came after him and where the movement ended up, very far from what he actually claimed. You will find no one who judges this guy favorably outside of Reform circles. Absolutely no one. I'm not saying this was a good idea or a bad idea. I'm just trying to analyze fact. I'll tell you like this. In his time, the man considered himself a theologian. Some of the Christians were quoting him. He was considered pretty learned and knowledgeable in his ability to attempt to reconcile religion and science. So he saw scientific advancement as a good thing. He saw these discoveries as a good thing. He saw the refinement of culture as a good thing. People weren't necessarily walking around, clubbing each other to death and stealing things. And society had advanced a little bit. It had become a little bit more civil. And he wasn't advocating for the abandonment of the Torah. He was advocating for what you would call today laïcité in a French-speaking society. He was just perfectly fine with people not bringing religion into the town square at all. Didn't matter if it was Christianity or Judaism, he didn't care. He just didn't think that religion should be the guiding political force of the time. It happened to be a really good shidduch between his theology and that of Martin Luther, because Luther didn't want the priests controlling people. He didn't want the priests making decisions for people. He didn't think the church had any room anymore in a civil society making decisions and determinations for people, right? This movement was very much a liberalizing movement. They wanted freedom from the church. You could choose whatever church you want. You could choose not to go to a church. Luther wasn't a fan of secular society. He just thought that the way that a properly Christian society ought to function is people do what they do because they understand and because they believe, and not because they're being forced to. which is why he was a big fan of printing the Bible in whatever language you speak. And go ahead, you read it. Don't you think it's beautiful? Don't you think it's great? Aren't these words so true and so inspiring? And you can read the writings of the early theologians. He wasn't trying to secularize people. On the contrary, he thought people would be more genuinely religious if they read and understood and knew what they were doing. And you can't ignore that influence on the early reformers, who weren't saying we should stop being observant. They were saying you don't have to hide from science in order to put on tefillin in the morning. You don't have to pretend. There's no such thing as musical scales or stars and galaxies if you'd like to continue keeping Shabbat. It's not a contradiction.
So, what's the difference between the one last sentence you mentioned, because before I kind of interrupted you? What's the difference between that and pretty much the modern Orthodox movement now?
That's the subtle point that I was trying to make.
Okay, you're getting there. I'm sorry.
Look, modern Orthodoxy is a very difficult concept. Effectively, is that what Mendelssohn was probably trying to do? Yes.
There was no such thing. There's no thing that was
That's exactly where I was going with this.
the Haredim and
It was
the Reforms at the time.
you were either Orthodox or you weren't. And
Did the word
I don't know if
Orthodox
it's to his
exist in
credit or
Judaism?
discredit. No.
It's pretty
The word
recent.
Orthodox did exist in Christian circles.
Yeah, but not in Judaism.
You had the Greek, Serbian, Armenian, Russian, I think parts of Ukraine. I think most of it is Catholic. Now it is for sure. The Orthodox Church was used to be bigger, and it was diminished in a few. Poland is all Catholic, for example. But it was the map was drawn a little bit differently. They called it Orthodox, right? So ortho means straight, like orthopedics,
Yeah.
straightening out people's legs. And dox is a doctrine. I mean, this is like the straight doctrine. The way they believe, just like everybody else. Our religion is original, our understanding of it is the authentic one, everyone else is a heretic. So when they said orthodoxy, I think the term was used more pejoratively than anything else, because obviously, naturally, you're the only ones who understand how things work and how things function, and which halachot and mitzvot apply, which ones don't. The difference, though, is that we never advocated for ignorance. The Rabbanim never profited from a largely ignorant community. It's very difficult to lead an ignorant community. In Judaism, anyway, I don't know if it works in Catholicism. I think that was the mode du jour. The more ignorant the people are, the easier it is to control them. It was never that way by us. And on the contrary, you see Rabbanim from every single generation crying about the fact there are people in my community who don't know how to read, that people don't know how to write, people don't observe the mitzvot. Mendelssohn probably would have been very happy if he were able to articulate some kind of modern Orthodox theology. I don't think he intended. I think the word on the street, and I haven't corroborated this, but apparently none of his grandchildren married Jews, or at least not most of them. He did start quite an avalanche. But the idea that, and he made some comments that people took offense to. I would, anyway. I mean, his famous expression on the applicability of religion and religious lifestyle to your larger societal life, living in a non-Jewish country, was be a Jew at home and a man outside. Meaning, man is in the German term Mensch, which means like a more human being, right? And naturally, what we would call today the Orthodox community said, so I'm not a human being? I wear a kippah, I have tzitzit, I keep Shabbat, and all of a sudden I'm subhuman to you? Is that? So either that, or you're playing into the anti-Semitic rhetoric that, no, of course Jews aren't human. So you can be Jewish in your own home, and that's fine, but when you're outside, be a man. Show them that you can be a human being, that you can read, you can write, you don't walk on your knuckles. They love that stuff. And if that's what you're saying, you're basically saying that the non-Jews were right in the way they look at Jews as primitive and antiquated, and so get with the program, become more modern. So it wasn't about shaving with blades. It wasn't about he made other relatively radical comments. I don't think he probably, let's put it this way. The most powerful argument against Mendelssohn's theology was that it was a theology that was perfectly convenient for the Jew in exile. If nothing else, you can accuse the man of not really thinking outside of Germany or outside of the Jews living as a minority in an overwhelmingly Christian country. He wasn't talking about we should go back to our roots, we should yearn for Zion, we should go back and build Beit HaMikdash. That wasn't where he was at the time. I'm sure in his heart of hearts he would like he would have loved for that to happen. What he was trying to do was trying to reconcile the advancements, developments of the modern world in the humanities and the sciences and in philosophy, etc. And at the same time, enable people to be observant and not feel bad about it and stay Jewish while doing so. But we're going to see over the course of probably next week and the week after that, that reforms, there are no brakes on these things. There's no conductor to that train. I mean, once you say something and you start an avalanche, you lose control over it. Very interesting concept. Chazal compared Lashon Hara to an arrow, that once you fire it, you lose control over it, and wherever it goes, and whatever it kills, it kills. I mean, it's basically what happens. You basically, you got the car in gear, you decided that, we need to move, we need to go somewhere, and you don't get to decide where it stops rolling. It just keeps on going. So it could be that, and there's a counter movement to this. I don't know if we'll get to it. Hopefully we'll get to it next week. The beginnings of what we call today modern orthodoxy, this still precedes the conservative movement, but the beginnings of modern orthodoxy were basically the Malbim of Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. This is the 19th century Germany and Romania and elsewhere, where, like it or not, the Rabbanim were looking at things differently and advocating for a lot of the same things that you might think Moses Mendelssohn would advocate for, except they had the experience of an additional 100+ years of Reform Judaism. Very quickly, the question came up, we'll talk about this more next week, in terms of what happened in Germany in particular. Germany is really where it all got started, and where the wars between the Jewish factions got really nasty. But the question came up at some point, do we keep these people in our Beit Knesset? So if during the week you were a reformer and you stopped wearing a kippah, you stopped putting on tefillin or doing whatever, at least in public, should these people be admitted into the Beit Knesset? Today we would ask if you would accept membership from someone like this. Should they be allowed to vote on shul issues? The question is, if they subscribe to the same system of beliefs and they're voting in good faith in order to do what's right for the community, it's one thing. If they believe we should dismantle the Beit Knesset and start living like Goyim, maybe they shouldn't be, at least not voting. And then you had a big movement, a big pull on the part of the rabbis that understood what was happening to try to accommodate and tolerate as much as they could without breaking. Red lines had to be drawn. Wherever they were drawn, you were going to lose people. Then it became a fight. Who can save more people without, diluting the message or without harming the observance of the mitzvot? So is it technically a problem for someone to study music and become a professional musician? No. Can you keep Shabbat? Must you play on Shabbat? Because if that's the case, then what's the point? Is it possible that you become a doctor or a lawyer or whatever it is and not, violate Shabbat? So the Orthodox approach would have been, we were always able to do these things. We didn't always have the right to in the countries that we were living in, but whatever occupation you had, you were expected to work honestly and fairly. We'll talk about Ribit in a little bit.
The Rambam was a doctor as well.
He was.
So you have examples like...
He was. Was he a reformer?
No, but...
Well, believe it or not, a lot of them refer to him because the Morad Nevuchim makes a lot of references to the science of his times, to astronomy, to the way the world functions and how it was created. So they'll tell you, look, we also draw from the science of our times. We also draw from, whatever medical health knowledge we have available to us. Advances in agriculture have made it such that maybe learning Mishnayot about oxen plowing fields and your bull goring my bull aren't necessarily as applicable as they used to be. Obviously, we still learn halachot from these things. But the arguments aren't hard to understand where they're coming from. In the end, what inevitably happened was that this just never stopped. And every generation since, you're going to find they added something else, they took something else out. They keep on reformulating their tenets. I'll bring you some stuff in print, if you want, next week, of what various incarnations of, today I think they call it the Association of American Rabbis. It's basically what insofar as there is a theologically oriented religious leadership to the Reform movement, every 5 or 10 years they just say more and more crazy things that they believe in, and they avoid reference to anything that might be offensive or insulting, like Torah mitzvot and Maasim Tovim. So it's there's a lot of history to it. A lot of these items are still being hotly contested. If you're aware of what goes on in Jewish circles, Yeshiva University is never really considered in very high regard by most of the Haredi community. In Israel, it's Bar Ilan, and in some cases, they do say and publish some bizarre things, but this is the pendulum already swinging back the other way. This is from what was Torah and Mitzvot as we knew them for thousands of years. There was a push on the part of the Reform, a push back from the Haredim, and modern Orthodoxy is kind of trying to straddle the middle ground and say, look, we can adopt and accept certain things, and there are other things that we do just because that's the way they are, and we're not going to change them. Although there are people who don't see the point. Where it's gone from then is already, basically one Reformation after another, and what was reformed in the 1700s looks today like Haredi. I mean, save for maybe a trimmed beard, I think some of the individuals then and their level of religious practice is more than most modern Orthodox people is today. It is what it is, but the movement itself didn't exactly come to a halt. If anything, it just got more and more intense. By the way, Hasidut is also a response to this. The Hasidim were the movement within the Haredi circle that tried to reach out to as many less educated, less literate communities in Jewish regions, and find a way to legitimize their practice and their belief and their observance without forcing them to go necessarily to university or to secular schooling, while encouraging them to learn whatever Torah they could. The accusation on the part of Lithuanian, or German too, by the way, anti-Hasidic movements, was that they were basically perpetuating ignorance, and people weren't going to school. A lot of them were very poor, rural farmers. They couldn't afford schools. They didn't have them. But the Hasidut was also effectively a response to the Reform movement. Once the Reform movement got some momentum and got into high gear, large groups of massive populations in big cities all over Europe started to become secular, and the Hasidim were another response to this. We'll talk about this, the Orthodox response to Reform, but that's definitely one aspect of it. That there's either doubling down on the Haredi mentality and lifestyle, trying to incorporate modernity wherever possible, and then there's the Hasidut, which basically tried to re-inspire people to find their own level of observance and do what they can, given where they were coming from. So we'll take a quick 5-minute break. We'll continue